Hello and welcome to How Do You Cope with me, John Robbins. This is the show where I sit down with special guests to talk about the challenges they've overcome and the coping mechanisms they use in their everyday lives. Today's guest is comedian, presenter and podcaster Nish Kumar. Nish began performing stand-up at university. His career in comedy has seen him take numerous shows to the Edinburgh Fringe, host radio shows and podcasts, including The News Quiz, The Bugle and Pod Save the UK, and front television shows including The MASH Report. Nish is someone who has made a career in speaking truth to power, and in an increasingly polarised political environment, this has led to him receiving a lot of hate and abuse. And a lot of this abuse not only has its roots in racism, but is overtly racist. In our conversation, we spoke about how the fallout from a charity gig in 2019 led to Nish seeking professional therapeutic help. We discussed the stress of speaking up for what you believe in a political landscape that's become so openly prejudiced in the last few years, and also how diagnosis of ADHD and anxiety disorders interact with creativity. And I wanted to know, just how does he keep going? Before we get started, don't forget that you can now watch every new episode of How Do You Cope on YouTube. Just search for How Do You Cope Pod, and you can, of course, listen to all episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Whether you're watching or listening, please hit subscribe so you don't miss any future releases. For more info or to get in touch, head to howdoyoukopepod.com. So here's my conversation with Nish. I do hope you enjoy it. So a very warm welcome to How Do You Cope to Nish Kumar. How are you doing, Nish?
What a pleasure to be here, John.
Thank you for coming. And we've got the studio set up differently. So on the one hand, we've got the Help I Sexted My Boss studio, which we're looking at. And to your right, you have some tissues in case you become emotional.
I can't wait to really get into it and be lost in thought about some piece of emotional honesty that I'm trying to convey to you, and then just see Help I Sexted My Boss in a massive speech bubble.
Well, we like to have, light and shade on this podcast. So, I've known you a long time and seen a lot of your stand-up over the years. And I thought, because there's quite a lot of different threads to the Nish Kumar trauma tree. Well, there's certainly lots of different topics we could talk about.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with a gig I saw you do at the Lord's Taverners. Because I think it's a sort of an interesting petri dish for lots of different areas of your life and career.
For sure. The only reason I laughed, it's actually a very obvious starting point. It's funny to me. There is something really strange when you do stand-up about something. So a couple of years after this happened, I turned it into a whole stand-up show. It's like a whole 80-minute show where the narrative spine is the stuff that happened. And I think this is probably quite a strange thing to say, but once it becomes a show that you've done that many times, you sort of turn it becomes like metafiction. Like you sort of turn it into something that is its own story.
Like a false memory.
Yeah. And then you forget that when I speak to you, Miles Jupp, Tim Key, Chris Addison, you were all present at the real event.
So let me just explain to listeners what we're talking about. So the Lord's Taverners is a children's sports charity and disability inclusion charity.
A wonderful charity.
Whose aim is to, quote, empower and positively impact the lives of young people facing challenges of inequality. And you were invited to perform a set at a charity event. And quite a few comedians were there. I think they're sort of trying to get young blood into the organisation.
And again, it's cricket.
Yeah,
so
it's a cricket charity.
Young blood is
mid-40s.
People in their mid-30s to mid-40s.
So I always struggle watching Friends especially, or any comedian in any kind of semi-corporate environment, because it's just, how difficult they can be.
Yeah.
So
and I'd been in your position. So I'd been the previous year when Ramesh was doing the set. Yeah.
So I went upstairs to watch, and you started by talking about cricket, and it was going really well. And I thought, fantastic, perfect booking. Nish knows his cricket. He's connecting with them. And I went for a wee. And I came back from the wee, and I'm stood at the top on the balcony, and the tone of the room had just changed. And I came downstairs and sat in my seat, and we were quite near the front. And it sort of went, you were starting to talk about Boris Johnson and Tory policy, and the tone went from sort of we don't do politics here vibe to a quite aggressive, like, shut up, boo vibe. And I'm sort of astonished because in retrospect, a charity who are seeking to positively impact the lives of young people facing challenges of inequality, what you were talking about is the causes of inequality.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's sort of, even though maybe they weren't expecting politics, it makes sense.
Yeah.
And then someone threw a bread roll at you.
Correct.
And it's sort of funny to say that, but it is funny. It is also you had something thrown at you at a gig.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen every day.
No.
So maybe we could talk about what's going on there, because I think politics, when was that?
2019, December 2019.
So things have moved on way beyond that now.
Yeah.
But what do you think was happening, especially with that idea that you're speaking truth to power, which is like one of your main mission statements of your stand-up, in a place where there's a lot of power?
Sure.
And they couldn't really cope with that.
Yes. And the thing that I never really talk about, and I don't know if you remember this, but the thing that I've never really discussed is that just before I went on, they had the sort of round table discussion, and Harry Redknapp, the football manager, made a kind of jocular reference to his tax avoidance, and it had got a laugh in the room. And I think in my head, there was a part of me that thought, well, if we're laughing about that, then everything's on the table. You know, we don't do politics as an interesting thing if you're also willing to laugh at someone making a joke about. I think there was a story where he'd put something in his dog's name to avoid tax, and that was a sort of joking reference he made. And and it was the week before the general election, and you know, John Bercow was there, who was the then Speaker of the House. And so I tell you what it felt. It felt like there's a sort of high-minded answer to this, and then there's an honest answer to this. And the high-minded answer to this is I felt that, you know, at a charity event like that, where you're addressing inequality, there's a imperative to discuss, like you say, the kind of background to this and the reasons for the inequality. The real truth is, John, I had fuck all else. In truth, that was what my stand-up was geared towards. That was all the material that I had. And it was all that was on my mind. You know, I was kind of in the middle of the cycle. I had just finished a cycle of doing the MASH report, which was a topical show. You know, I'm a sort of semi-regular contributor to The Bugle, Andy Zoltzman's podcast, which is, again, sort of topical show. And all of my stand-up had become geared to this sort of, you know, what was going on in the country at the time, as it is now. And so I didn't really have anything else. And I also thought, well, you know, there's a lot of people in this room who these jokes are kind of aimed at. And I think the thing that I was thinking is, if you're going to have, you've got to have the guts to say this stuff in front of people who you think might not like it. I think my honest truth is that, aside from having no other material, I also felt, you know, I do this material to what our friend Ellis James refers to as crowds of braying acolytes. And I think if you're willing to do it to the BAs, I felt very strongly that whatever the consequences, there had to be I had to do it to people who I thought it might not be received well by.
Yeah.
So as soon as it started and it kind of went off the rails, there's a very funny scene in, not very funny, there's a scene in A Complete Unknown, the Dylan biopic. And there's a lot of bits of that film that are, you know, it's an entertaining film. There's a lot of bits that, for a Bob Dylan obsessive like myself, are not factually correct, but that's fine. It's you know, you have to sort of expedite events for fictionalization. The one thing they get bang on is the Newport scene at the end when a gig goes off the rails. Because the view from the stage, the actual shot of the crowd, because there's a moment where the crowd disassembles. Like in an ideal world, the audience is a single entity that you're addressing, right? But watching that disassemble is quite an extraordinary thing. And so from the stage, I'm watching this room come apart. I'm watching Chris Addison get in a screaming row with somebody who was shouting things. Tim Key is looking at me with the same facial expression Jerry Seinfeld gives Larry David when he's doing the producers in Curb Your Enthusiasm and it's going off the rails. Key is shrugging his shoulders and looking at me.
Then he started to boo.
Which
Tim was hilarious.
Tim Key did boo. And then at one point, the bread roll came at me. I saw it roll to my right, so it was not a very good throw. And then I kind of stayed there, and I was sort of just saying to them, listen, I'm going to do my time. There's a video of it. You can see the kind of video of me at the end. And then a man who, sort of came out of the audience he was sort of dressed like someone from the military in the late 19th century, sort of comes out and takes me off stage. And then you go off stage and then you sort of sit down at this table and you've got a few people there who are just looking at you like, yeah, we've been there. You, Key, Chris, there's a sort of camaraderie to it.
Yeah, I guess so. Why I'm interested to talk about it especially is that you had not grossly misread the situation. They had booked Nish Kumar, a comedian, to do comedy.
Yeah.
And you did the comedy that Nish Kumar, the comedian, does. And it represents to me something about the way our political discourse has changed and has changed massively since that point. For the worse. Because it feels like the sort of comedy you do, which was, very common in like the 90s and the early 2000s, has now become not just an act of rebellion, but almost in some circles it's like, I've read some commentary about, in inverted commas, left-wing comedians by, in inverted commas, right-wing media outlets. And just the standard of the journalism is so poor.
Yeah.
But it seems to be this idea that sort of people who are standing up for pretty basic decency are some kind of really weak, problematic, moaning bunch of wet lefties.
Or tantamount to sort of Maoist guerrillas.
Yeah.
The reaction was pretty bananas.
But have you felt that throughout your career, or is that getting worse?
No, I never felt that. To be honest with you, I talk about this quite a lot. I felt pre-Brexit, sort of pre the year 2016, because it isn't just Brexit. That's a big sort of focal point. When I would do comedy about the news in a comedy club, the reaction was not disgust or anger. The reaction was total disinterest and boredom. The immediate reaction, I remember trying to get jokes about the coalition government and just people just glazing over, like just not interested. You used to have to, it would take a long time because you'd have to sort of explain who everybody was. Sort of everyone apart from Cameron Osborne and maybe Clegg, you'd have to sort of do a full primer for them.
Yeah.
And I remember there being years where the problem was not offense. The problem was the mass disinterest of the comedy audience. Then after 2016 into sort of 2017, there was a shift. I mean, there was literally a shift in my career. So I've had all sorts of things, as we all have, yelling stuff, drunk people. I've even had people throw things before, but it's sort of general, just that's sort of the cut and thrust of comedy clubs. But literally the night of Brexit, I was doing a gig at the Comedy Store, and it was the Friday night, so the vote had happened on the Thursday. So we'd woken up on the Friday morning, we were sort of processing the results, and I was sort of doing some jokes about it and saying like, I don't know what the fuck is happening. Like, what are we doing? What does this mean for the country? And somebody shouted, "You can go home," literally the night of the vote, and I remember I was supposed to meet James Acaster for a drink because we were doing gigs. The Comedy Store, you do an early show and a late show, and he was doing a gig across Leicester Square, and we were supposed to have a drink between the early show and the late show. And I remember, and he remembers coming to the Comedy Store, and as he arrived, the security guard on the door saying, "I think you better come with me because he's not getting out of there at the moment." Because the guy who had shouted stuff was waiting outside to continue the conversation. And the security guards had locked me in the back room. And so there was all this kind of sort of chaos happening out there. And then, and then another gig that, continues to traumatize Brett Goldstein and may well be part of the reason why he moved to America to make films with Jennifer Lopez, is that we were doing a gig at the 99 Club, and a man was so angry about my material that he unplugged my microphone. Like, it was a really febrile few years.
And a sort of side issue, I'm guessing these are the sorts of people who might say you can't say anything anymore.
What, 100%.
The world's gone mad.
Yeah.
You get cancelled for calling this or that. And yet, I think that's something I struggle to, not having to go through any of this sort of thing. But do you not see the enormous contradiction at the heart of you unplugging a comedian's microphone because you don't like what they're saying in a world where you think you're not allowed to say anything?
Oh, man, John, there's some of the stuff that happened to me in those years is almost beyond parody. And, I sort of only really took stock of it in 2021 when I was getting ready to write the show in 2022 about all of this stuff. There were constantly articles in the Daily. So there's all this kind of febrile tension at gigs, but that's kind of, and that I also grew up idolizing a lot of people that really wound people up for whatever reason, political reasons, because they started playing electric guitar. I'm sort of well used to this idea that the audience, and because I was my hero is Bob Dylan, I have sort of a relatively philosophical approach to it, because when he was being booed, he basically would say things like, well, they pay their ticket, they got the right to boo, and so I didn't really have a problem with any of that stuff. The thing that shifted was when I started doing the MASH report on the BBC, because then articles started popping up in newspapers, and then it became less. There's an honesty to something that happens in a room when you're doing comedy. But when it starts being written about in papers, it shifts the tone slightly. And in the middle of all of that, there was a period of time where someone at the Daily Mail had written an article saying that the BBC needed to seriously look into the MASH report, and that it needed to think about pulling it off the air, essentially. And then the Daily Mail, I was hosting the Freedom of Expression Awards, and the Daily Mail was one of the media partners. And in my kind of opening remarks, I said some wise ass shit about, I'm glad that they've just had a turnaround in their views on free speech. And it was received so poorly by the organisers of the event. I got told off by Trevor Phillips, who went on stage afterwards, which, to be honest, if I'm being completely frank with you, I sort of consider a badge of honour. And then Matthew Parris wrote an article in the Times essentially saying, I'm amazed that he managed to get through writing this, but the essential thesis was what I'd done was too offensive for the Freedom of Expression Awards.
But I don't know how you do what you do, because what you just described there is like the world's mad.
Yeah.
That's mad.
Yeah.
And yet I just get the impression if any of those media outlets were listening to this or reviewing it or coming up with a comment, they'd be like, braying liberals, Nish Kumar and John Robbins and it's like you're not actually engaging with the logic of what is being said.
Yeah, they didn't really see. You know, I'm always fascinated to know how Matthew Paris made it through writing that article.
Because he's like a man of intelligence. He has held positions
Allegedly,
in which
yeah.
you need intelligence. Like you need a critical thinking brain.
It's
So how do you not go? How do you continue to do what you do? I guess in the face of the fact that your critics are not necessarily playing with a full deck.
well,
Because it's not like a comedy reviewer is saying oh, the premise of the start of the show is really good, but then he sort of there's a bit that's too wordy, or he sort of goes off track. It's not that they're not criticizing you on those terms.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to sort of. Yes, it's an interesting thing for people to sort of be ideologically opposed to your comedy. That is a really interesting position. And it's a position that I sometimes find myself occupying because there is some comedy that I am ideologically opposed to. And it's interesting. It's an interesting thing. And so I'm not necessarily against it because I believe they have the right to write whatever they want. I'm not angry that Matthew Paris wrote that article. I just don't understand how he didn't see the irony, how he had no appreciation of how funny it is to say something was too offensive for the Freedom of Expression Awards. But then there was also, so I mean, the reality is I was just sort of, I was like willing to put myself out there, and I was willing to go to bat for the things that I believed in. I think there's a couple of things that happened in those years that were sort of egregious. One of the things that there's friends of mine who were occupying similar positions, not necessarily in comedy, but in other elements of culture, whether they were sort of novelists or actors or writers of nonfiction. One of my friends will often talk about this idea that because in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, the project malfunctioned. Now, that's not me making an ideological assessment of Brexit, though my views are well documented. All I'm saying is, from a totally objective perspective, it didn't go well. And part of the reason it didn't go well is the thing that the campaign was praised for was its lack of definition, that it could be all things to all people. Unfortunately, once you vote for that, you have to actually apply this thing. And you've essentially created this constantly moving, ephemeral idea that people can get behind. But then when it becomes about trade negotiations and border arrangements, it's quite, you actually have to define terms, and that's part of why it sort of was malfunctioning. And in that malfunctioning, there was a kind of lashing out from a lot of the media outlets and politicians that had actively supported it as a movement, and they just started lashing out at anybody. And there was a lot of hostility to some writers of color that were speaking out about it. There was a lot of hostility. The Daily Mail published a front page deeming the judges that were stifling the process as enemies of the people. And the only reason they were stifling the process is it was not being executed in a way that was consistent with the laws of the country. And so there was a lot of very heightened rhetoric that was kind of caused, I think, by this project malfunctioning. And then the Conservative Party began to malfunction. And Theresa May chose to call that election in 2017. Then she loses a huge amount of ground. So then she can't function in her government. And so then there was a lot of ideological hostility and a need to attack and lash out at anyone criticizing the overall project. Then there is this other thing of the BBC. And I was the face of a TV show on the BBC. And a lot of the criticism of me in that moment was a proxy battle about whether the BBC should exist at all. And then there's a third thing. There's the race question, which makes me sound like a sort of Victorian anthropologist. There are still people in this country, and some of them unfortunately have newspaper columns that just saw my face and said no.
There's a really good quote from you where you say, "There are newspaper columnists who did not believe that someone of my skin colour should be able to have an opinion on the operation of the British government, and that any criticism I expressed was a form of ingratitude."
Yes.
And I think that's a very succinct way of saying that there is there is an undercurrent in this country that minority groups, whether that be people of colour, LGBTQ community, trans people, disabled community, basically, broad strokes, white men are going to make decisions about your life, and you have to be grateful for the scraps.
Yeah.
And anything that's slightly better is like probably more than you deserve, actually.
Yeah. If you're a working class person and you make a critique of the state, you've got a chip on your shoulder.
Yeah.
If you're a woman talking about equal rights for women, you're hysterical, and actually can't you see how many rights you have already?
Yeah.
It's the same criticisms it's the same dog shit that's been trotted out for years and years. It's not really anything new. But I remember being on a train to Edinburgh in the summer of 2017. I was going up to do a couple of shows and do something at the TV festival. And I was sat on the train with my partner, Amy, and we saw someone turn over the Daily Mail. And it was a double-page feature where my photo was in the middle of it. And it was right after the MASH report had just started.
You're thinking, this isn't a 5-star review of my work in progress.
I'm
not going to be putting this on my posters when I get to Edinburgh.
I don't think the headline reads, "This man is good." But Amy, it actually sort of wasn't about me. It was something to do with the commissioner. But it began this kind of period of time where you'd see, I'd see my face in the newspaper and you'd actually look at the article and it almost had nothing to do with me. But Amy said very early, I think you need to see a therapist because I don't think this is a normal experience you're about to go through. For all the reasons that we've just outlined. She was very sort of aware, and she was being very smart about what the experience was likely to be like. And I resisted, which is, so I guess the issue with men our age, I think particularly straight men our age, is that we sort of know all the right things we should be doing. And so we're very good at giving other people advice. So if somebody described the circumstances I was in 2017, I would say, oh yeah, you should definitely see a therapist because I think it's going to be quite a weird experience. But at the time, I refused. And I also felt that I did feel that it was ingratitude, not in the sense that I was being criticised for in the papers, but it was ingratitude to say, oh, I need mental health support to deal with the TV show that I host. I genuinely thought it was indulgent.
I think also as comedians or any creative who doesn't do a proper job that then becomes a proper job.
Yeah.
You're so grateful that you're able to make a living out of this when so few people can.
Yeah. That
you do feel a sense of, well, this is what you get for being one of the 0.1% of people who get paid, can pay their rent doing this, can maybe be on telly, can have a podcast, can have an audience. And because you spend all your time around people doing exactly the same thing, it's quite normalized. So for Amy to go, by the way, seeing a newspaper of yourself in what's probably going to be a very critical article on board a train is not happening to many people and is unusual, and you might need some guidance of how that affects you, is really important.
Yeah, and in my head I was thinking, well, that's no different from bad reviews. I've had bad reviews, but what she was trying to say to me is, no, that's not the same. A comedian doing a show that gets reviewed, you understand all of the variables at play there. The review could be good, the review could be bad. But there's something that's happening here that's out of your control. This isn't a TV review. If it was a TV review, she said I wouldn't raise this. The show is going to get bad reviews and we'll get good reviews. But this is not a review. This isn't somebody who's assessing your work on its relative merits. They're having an ideological argument about the existence of the state broadcaster or the rights of ethnic minorities who were born in this country to opine on the state of the government. This stuff is not normal. So I just sort of buried my head in the sand. And then in the start of 2018, the show began to be very successful. And
which show is this?
The MASH report. Yeah. And clips from it started going viral. And so so in summer of 2017, it started, and it's, rating in the kind of whatever, I can't remember the ratings, to be honest. They were kind of verging on 1 million, like nothing that's earth shaking. But then January 2018, clips from the show, and it was the sort of first British show to kind of attempt this idea that television could be cut up and put on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And then suddenly it sort of had a global audience. And there is something funny about British people in every area of the media. When they think Americans are watching, it changes how they relate to it. And Americans started watching and talking about the show. And from our side, we started going, oh my God, that's, Madonna shared a clip from the show. We all started trembling with excitement and a kind of cultural inferiority. And then the press attention sort of multiplied exponentially as well. And so then it kind of took 2018. It was pretty intense when I look back at it now. And then in 2019, it was also pretty intense, and stuff like this thing with the sensitive thing. It just all was sort of chipping away at me. So then we do this gig. So I'm already now this kind of, a character in the culture war. And so then this gig becomes this kind of flashpoint. But then afterwards, we all went to the pub.
Well, that was one of my questions is about this, because had I gone through what you had gone through, I would have been off stage well before my time. I would have been out of a back door. I would have been home. I would have got absolutely hammered on my own.
Yeah.
And you went to the pub, and to the outside, to me, I'm thinking, how the hell is he doing this?
Yeah.
He's drinking with the people who were in there. There are people coming up to him saying, oh, I liked it, mate. You're all right. I would be like, get out.
Well, it's interesting because I felt very protected by the group of you that I was with. You, Miles Jupp, Tim Key, Chris Addison, Vic Marks. I was also just excited to meet Vic Marks.
And a lot of people were very apologetic.
And a lot of people were apologetic. And also, at that stage, what had happened is I had had a bad gig. And it was a theatrically bad gig in a lot of ways, because it was a corporate that was unpaid, essentially. And corporates are notoriously bad, and the whole point of them is you get through them because of the money. But obviously there was no money because I was trying to support the charity. It was sort of the whole thing was really strange. But I was at that point in the day, I was still a comedian that had a bad gig. I often, when I had bad gigs, would, especially when it was in London, you'd just go to the pub with your friends and you'd sort of laugh about it and commiserate about it. And what was great was you normally have to describe what had happened. But because I was with all you guys, you'd seen what had happened. And, I guess I felt very protected because Miles Jupp is extremely tall. And so I think there's a joke in that show that something like Miles Jupp picked me out. And because he's very tall, it was like he carried me out like an Ent from Lord of the Rings. But so I felt fine. And then Tim Key always says, like he said, I couldn't believe it. You were out, we were making fun of you, we were all sort of commiserating about it. It was great, it was healthy, because I still believe and defend the right of the audience to boo me. I believe in that they had that right. I really do. I don't think the person who threw the bread should have thrown the bread. I don't think you should ever put hands on a performer or throw things at them. But booing is an occupational hazard. I had no problem with honestly anything. I thought it was embarrassing, but it's not legit. It's not illegitimate. But then somebody said, "Oh, there's an article in the Telegraph about it." Because obviously it turns out if you're in a room with extremely well-connected people...
Who all work for the Telegraph. If you're in a room with the entire staff of the Telegraph...
And Tim Key always says, that's the moment where your face changed. He always says, we were having a great time. And then right at the end, just as literally we were about to all get in our cabs and go home. Because we did a solid day's drinking, and and at the end of that day, we were still in pretty good spirits. And then Key always says, somebody said there's an article in the Telegraph, and I looked at the phone and he said, I think I saw your face change, because I knew, I think once it had got out of the room, something else was going to happen. You know, you already have this background of me as this kind of whatever culture war cartoon. But when something gets out of a gig, we've seen it with so many different news stories about things that happen at gigs, and then the news story is written up, and the people who are actually there will often say, you know, that's not really what happened.
Well, you're losing control of a narrative to people who are quite happy to give a very biased narrative.
Yeah.
Like you're being now used.
Yeah.
I wondered if we could skip though, because I think this is related. So when the MASH report got, or the cancelled or stopped,
Yeah.
The response to the MASH report had taken an enormous toll on you. And
Yeah.
it did, I'm right in saying, did include death threats.
So, no. The death threats happened because of the Lord's gig.
No way.
Yeah. That's when the death threats happened.
That is absolutely wild.
Yeah. The death threats happened, the 24 hours after the Taverners gig is when it all happened. I mean, I was getting some threats of violence on Twitter. I know this sounds like an odd thing to sort of slightly sweep under the carpet, but there's truly just an amount of background noise of threats of violence that particularly, you know, left-wing political people were just getting on. And there's just a level of that exists on the internet. The issue after the Taverners was that it was getting messaged to me. And one of them, which I do read out in the show, which is like, I mean, as in, it's sort of like offensive to about 5 different. It's actually like almost remarkable that they've managed to offend the amount of groups that they managed to offend in the death threat. But that came into my private Facebook from an unknown account. And that was the thing that absolutely spun me out. And I was going to Manchester to do a charity gig for Amnesty International the day after. And so I was on the train and I was just taking all of it in. The press, the death threats, you know, there were people like, there's sort of a person leaving voice messages on my Facebook. And it was really, really intense. And I remember I actually put the death threat on a text group that we're both on. And I sort of put it on there. I don't know why I put it on there. So I put it on there as saying, wow, isn't this is weird. And everybody just started replying saying, this has to go to the police. This has to go to the police. This has to go to the police. And I then contacted my agent and she said, I'm going to call the police now. She said, you have to just log out of all of these things. Like, don't look at your phone. Just shut everything down. I'm going to take over this whole thing now, like at this point. And we sort of had this meeting with the police and they were essentially telling us that no, this is sort of not really anything we can do. They were sort of just shrugging their shoulders. They were sort of saying, this isn't ideal. But there isn't really anything we can do. And I then had this, when I did the show, my agent, the first time she saw it, she said, you've misremembered quite a lot of that. And she said, you know, I had a separate meeting with the police before you sat down. I'd completely blanked out a lot of that stuff. And what I then, you know, a good sort of year and a half later would realize is the 24 hours after what happened, I have post-traumatic stress disorder from that 24 hours. And it was then, because I wasn't really doing anything about my mental health, and I didn't really understand what was happening to me. But I probably for a good sort of year and a half, I wasn't fully in control of my emotions after that happened. There would be weird things where I would be talking to somebody and then they would say something that, and this is a sort of overused word, but it does have a real diagnostic function where it would be triggered, and I would suddenly out of nowhere feel like, like I was in a tank and there was water just rising and rising and rising, and I couldn't quite catch my breath, and I would suddenly be getting teary out of nowhere. Didn't do anything about it. Nothing. Then lockdown. And so for a sort of year, I'm feeling strange. But also from, I was sort of thinking about it, thinking, of course I'm feeling strange. Of course I'm feeling sad.
We live in the strangest period
Yeah,
of
we live in the
human
strangest
history.
period of human history. We're all locked in our houses. I'm worried about my grandmother's safety. I'm thinking about, my family members. So in my head, I think I thought I was, but this is a real issue. Probably almost every day for a year and a half, or at least 4 times a week, my brain would start imagining what was happening. I would turn into my street and think there was somebody there that was going to kill me. And I would imagine that process and what it would be like to be stabbed or whatever it was. Lots of different types of things. I would imagine that process. And I was doing that multiple times a day. And I didn't realize that that was part of the process of me really damaging myself. I didn't realize I was sort of pulling apart my own brain, really.
So what you're talking about reminds me, actually, the book behind you, Surviving White Island by Kelsey Waghorn. So she was on a volcano in New Zealand when it erupted.
Wow.
And it killed lots of people. And she survived with terrible burns. But her description of PTSD, which she didn't understand she had at the time, is so similar to what you're saying. It's mood swings and mood changes entirely seemingly unrelated to the incident.
Yeah.
Where she would drop a teaspoon on the floor and burst into tears.
Yeah.
Or she would fly off the handle at her partner for some, forgetting to take the dog out or something.
Yeah.
So it's very hard logically to connect it to the cause.
Yeah.
So you're thinking, am I going mad?
Yeah.
But also that hypervigilance of rehearsing in your head, which is, if you're imagining yourself being murdered 4 times a day, that is the very definition of re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
And like when Amy talks to you about seeing the article in the paper going, this is unusual, you might need some help with this, you can sort of understand someone going, well, it's all part of the deal. But if someone came up to you and said, I imagine what it would be like if I was murdered multiple times a day, you would say, okay, buddy, we need to get you somewhere.
Yeah.
So
need a bit of help with that.
At what point did you decide to seek help, and what form did that first help take?
So probably in 2021, I think in sort of early 2021, I was on the phone with Brett and with Goldstein, and I still to this day don't fully know what it is that I've said, and he can't even really remember because I've asked him. But I was talking to him on the phone, and I was just talking, and he basically said, listen, I think you got to see a therapist. I don't think I can't remember. He can't even remember what it was. He just said, I heard something in your voice, and he just sort of said, you got to see a therapist. And obviously it's a source of great amusement for Amy Annette now to turn around and go, well, the captain of the woke Stasi won't listen to a woman.
But when Hollywood Goldstein comes calling.
And it is bad. And I have genuinely no comeback. But he said, and I had sort of thrown up all these excuses, because by something must have been happening, because I'd been talking about going to therapy with Amy, and I said something that, I did feel bad about saying, because Amy's white, and I said to her, I don't think I would want a therapist of color. Like I and I said, I hope that doesn't sound bad. And she said, no, when I was in therapy, I expressly sought out a female therapist because there were things that I wanted to talk about that I didn't feel like I could explain. And so she said, I don't think you need to feel bad about that. But I still didn't do it. So I was just looking for excuses to not go. And then Brett said, you need to see a therapist. And I said, yeah. By that point, obviously something had Amy in my conversation, because I didn't resist. I said, yeah. But I said, I'm really looking for someone quite specific. And he just said, I know a therapist who is a person of colour, and I'm emailing them right now. And so there wasn't really a conversation. Suddenly you're CC'd in on an email. And I think by that point, I'd obviously realised that something was off with me. I wasn't quite myself. And I think I started to realise it wasn't totally just the fact that we were in lockdown and everybody was struggling.
Well, not all of us were getting death threats in lockdown.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Hang on, I know, I don't think I got any.
It was, but it was everyone. We were all having a difficult time.
Oh yeah, life was crazy, but life was crazy on the terms of the craziness.
Yeah.
So what sort of form of therapy was it, and what did it throw up for you that maybe you weren't expecting? How did it surprise you?
What surprised me was how little I knew about what was happening with my own mind. That was the thing that surprised me. I'm a person who has identified themselves and defined themselves really by their intelligence from a young age. The thing that I prided myself on was exam grades, and achievement. And I sort of, so much of my identity is bound up in my education and how clever I am. And within, the first about 5 sessions in, she said to me, what do you think I'm treating you for? And I said, I'm having a tough time. And she said, I'm treating you for post-traumatic stress disorder. Everything you've said to me is completely, within 5 minutes of talking to you, I knew that you were a person that had PTSD. And that was the point where I remember thinking, yes, I don't know what's going on here. I actually have no clue what's happening here. And I don't really know fully I have no control over this. And I think that was the thing that surprised me, was that you could sort of, your mind could just completely be playing tricks on you the whole time.
It's a bit like, I was just thinking there, that it's so hard to see your own brain and the way it operates as a problem, because your brain is the place from which you solve all the problems.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like saying to a fish, there's a problem with the water.
Yeah.
But there can't be, because the water is the water. The problems are in the water. No, the problem is the water.
Yeah, that's a great way. The problem is the water is a great way of putting it, John. And also for people like you and me, who sort of, define themselves by their intelligence throughout their lives, that is, there's a level of arrogance. There's a real level of arrogance that there can't be anything wrong with my mind, because I can think my way out of anything.
Yeah. And when someone says to you, not only can you not think your way out of anything, the more you think, the worse it will get.
Yeah.
So this therapist is saying, I'm treating you for PTSD. What was that treatment? What tools did she give you? What understanding did she give you about how your brain was working in a way that you weren't noticing?
I will say, one of the things that we did was EMDR, which is something that people who've been through any kind of trauma therapy will have, I guess, at least given a go to. And it was really good. And it was, it is strange, because you sort of do these repeated patterns where you touch bits of your body or squeeze things, and then you kind of repeat these sort of disconnected tongue twisters. And the most helpful thing someone who's putting you through that process can say to you is, now I know this is going to sound weird. And just, it sort of diffuses the tension and stops you from raising your hackles to it. And then there was a lot of, writing things out, like writing out what happened, writing out, the events of that day, the events of that week. Because I was, and even, this is couple of years of therapy. And, I remember being really surprised when my agent said, you've misremembered a lot of this. Like there's stuff that the timeline isn't actually what happened. There's no way. Also, one of the worst things about it is she was basically able to say, yeah, the timeline is wrong because we had a meeting with the police on my birthday and the date of my birthday. And so there's a lot of, it was, what's the positive surprise I had was having been dragged kicking and screaming into this process, I did embrace it. So I didn't resist it in the way that I thought I would resist it. Now, that being said, it definitely is not a clean line, right? And so it wasn't, I didn't start doing it in 2021, and then by 2022, I was sort of cured of it. I had moved on enough in my mind that I was comfortably able to do the show about it and talk about the PTSD by 2022. I'd moved on enough that I wasn't, because there were times where I'd be asked about it and I could just feel my heart racing. And I don't think I could have done a show about it with all that still in my system. But that being said, in 2024, and by this point, I'm kind of 3 years in, I was in Edinburgh during the race riots. And I do a news podcast, so I'm sort of trying to cover it. I'm feeling really guilty because, friends of mine are going to counter demonstrations, and I'm sort of in Edinburgh following my artistic passions. There's a part of you that thinks, this isn't, you're not where you should be here. And I watched loads of footage of that and just was gone for really a full week. I was just completely not in my brain. And for a chunk of time in 2025, after the Tommy Robinson thing that happened in September, I again watched too much footage of that. And I don't think I was fully in control. There was a 2-month period where I was in and out of control of myself last year, from sort of October to late September to the start of November, where I was not fully able to operate the ship.
So what do you mean by that? How does that lack of ability to operate the ship show itself? And B, what ways did you get back control?
So the first time in 2024, it was the first time that it happened to me since I'd started therapy. And I wasn't, I see my therapist every week, and then there's bits because of work where I'm not able to see her for little chunks of time. And it was basically like, man, I wish there was a more high-minded way of describing this. In the first Avengers movie, there's a glass box that they lock Loki in, right? And they're like, you're secure in this thing. And then they kind of leave him in there. It was like I'd been locked in a glass box in my own brain. And in that, he's been put in jail to protect the other people. But for me, it was like my brain locked. Some people that operate my brain, the Inside Out gang, basically were like, you're not safe. So let's lock you up and we're going to put this thing onto autopilot. And so you feel completely disengaged from your emotions, and you feel you're sort of watching things happen to yourself around that. And people are talking to you, and you are not present or engaged. Now, at the time, my family was visiting, and my brother had has a baby, and who was a real baby at that point. And weirdly, the only time where my brain would sort of allow me to be present was when I was literally physically holding a baby, because your brain kind of goes, oh yeah, you got to be in full control here. There's a baby.
So I'm sort of describing dissociation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
And is that something you then took to your therapist, or was it something someone pointed out to you, or was it something that just went? Or
no, I knew what was going on. I knew what was happening to me, and I knew that I was struggling with it. And so then it was just a question of me getting to talk to my therapist, and also I had to leave Edinburgh. I was scheduled to leave Edinburgh because Ellis was getting married. Ellis and Izzy were getting married. So there was this sort of break clause in the middle of the month where I knew I had to go to London. And I between seeing my therapist and actually having this kind of break clause, because I was also going on stage every day and sort of continuing to talk about it, which was not helpful, really.
And then you saw a best man speech that cured you.
It was a It was a phenomenal best man speech. What I would say is, if you're going through any episode of disassociation, get yourself down to Izzy and Ellis James's wedding.
Yeah.
Watch a best man speech. Get yourself out of yourself.
So, like, I have periods where I am able to see in retrospect, oh, you were kind of nutso.
Yeah.
There. And it might just be an afternoon where something went wrong, or it might be a week or a couple of months, or, sometimes whole big chunks of time. So what was it in that break from Edinburgh and seeing your therapist? Can you remember when you sort of came back to yourself, when you, I guess, associated?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually the break from Edinburgh was where I kind of got back on level terms. The thing that kind of brought me back in the room, the thing that brought me back into my body a little bit was I knew I was struggling. I knew I was sad. I knew I was feeling depressed all the time. And I knew I was locked in this box and essentially allowing the autopilot to drive me through my day-to-day life. And I knew I was struggling. And this time I was able to say to Amy, I'm struggling. I was able to say to my promoters who just, Naomi Parnell and Rachel Illingworth were at every show and were basically, when I said to them, I'm really struggling, they said, let's just go home. Like, you can go home. And I didn't want to do that for some reason. But also I'd slightly come back into the room because I spoke to this kid. She must have been 18 or 19. She was a student at Leeds University. And she said she had been at one of the shows and she said, I'm really glad that you said you were scared. Now, I didn't realize I'd said that because I was not fully in control of what I was doing. She said, I'm really glad that you're scared. She was a person of color and she said, I'm really scared. And so I'm glad that you said you were scared because you're older than me. And it makes me feel a bit less nuts for feeling scared. And that was the thing that properly brought me back into my body. I was like, I'm scared. That's really what it is. I'm scared. And suddenly then I was able to kind of go, you can let me out of the box, fellas, because I'm not in denial about this anymore. So I knew enough to know that I was in denial about what was going on. My brain knew enough that to just fully disassociate because I couldn't be trusted to make good decisions. But I couldn't put my finger on what the actual, which sounds so obvious. But it was only when this kid said to me, I'm scared, I suddenly went, shit, so am I. I'm scared. And this footage of me in Edinburgh that occasionally sort of burbles up on the internet because we were doing a live podcast and you can see me on stage saying, I'm really scared, guys. But not being aware of what's going. It's a really interesting thing to see that footage for me because I'm completely articulating everything that's happening to me, but I had no ability to properly acknowledge it until someone else said to me, I'm scared. And then suddenly I was able to say, oh yeah, I'm scared too. Even though I'd been talking about it on stage. Because again, the autopilot lads, good job. They do a wonderful service.
And like the mind has fully taken over.
Yeah.
And the body is gone.
Gone.
So to actually feel that, I guess, moment of connection or even compassion to that girl, you're then like, oh, I need to do that to myself.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like if your ears are blocked after a flight. That's what I would say coming back into your body feels like. It feels like the moment your ears pop and suddenly all that sound comes rushing back in. And that is exactly how I sort of suddenly felt. And there was a point where you can say to the guys who were operating the machine, put me out of the cell. I can be back in charge now. And then I got to come home. I got to hang out with my mates. I spoke to my therapist, and then we were able to get me back into the room. Last year, the thing that was interesting was I sort of knew what was happening the whole time. And I sort of was like, I'm taking this real bad. I'm really struggling. And I know that it's because I'm scared. And I know it's linked to all of this PTSD stuff. And I know the whole thing is sort of interlinked. But it was a sort of unfortunate perfect storm of my therapist being away and Amy being out of the country for a couple of weeks, and me just like spinning out, just truly spinning out, and it sort of got bad enough that like people had to sort of be dispatched to sort of try and like chivvy me along. Amy sort of dispatched Acaster. To sort of basically be like, maybe just go and check on him, hang out with him for a little bit. But and then what brought me back that time, even though I knew what was happening to me, what really brought me back was my therapist being back and me going, this has happened. And she was like, let's talk about it. Let's get into it. And let's try and build. So what I'm saying is, it's not clean lines with this stuff, but you can see incremental improvement. So each one of those three things. So first time, no idea what's going on. Second time, idea something bad is happening, no idea what it is. Third time, know what's happening, know what's going on, can't stop it. So the next evolution for me is to be able to identify when it's about to happen and do things and that's the process that me and my therapist are in, and getting me to a stage where before it kind of goes off, I can go, okay, this is what, and so, you know, I'm a bit more cognizant when I'm looking at, you know, a lot of the footage of these kind of race riots, that I need to sort of be a bit sensitive to myself about it. And also we've dug in, we really now, you know, because she said for the first year we were just firefighting, really. We were just trying to get you back in your brain, back in your body. And now we're sort of trying to dig into all the other stuff, because she said, your mental health problems aren't the reason you get PTSD. That's a response to an event. But there are people for whom the event happens and because of their mindset. And so for me, the two sort of background, the sort of consistent problems are anxiety, and generalized anxiety disorder, and ADHD. And when you have those two things, your brain is just a kind of pinball machine, and the ball is just things to be worried about. And it's just sort of all of these things are like flashing all the time. And it's very common that people who have ADHD also have an anxiety disorder. Those are very common comorbidities. And so for me, I now understand, okay, my brain is sort of pinballing stuff around. So then if the thing that's pinballing around is bad, if the thing that's pinballing around, because we also have talked a lot about, she always says to me, you got nothing positive in your life from anxiety. Because there was definitely a point where I was saying to her, that's why I've done well in my career, because I obsess about things. And she, you know, because we do it on Zoom, I think it's a good thing, because there are so many times where I can feel her want to grab me by the shirt and shake me. She's always saying nothing in your life that's good has happened to you because of your anxiety.
It's happened in spite of it.
Every single time. Every single time she says, you have done the things that have happened to you have happened despite and not because. And she said, that's the pernicious thing about an anxiety disorder, is it tricks you into thinking that you need it and you can't survive without it. And
so are you medicated for ADHD?
No, I'm not medicated yet, because...
And are you planning to be?
We're sort of taking that, you know, we're like looking at that as a possibility. Yeah. And so we're starting with therapeutic stuff, and also we're trying to like align it with, because, you know, I have a bad family history of heart disease, and some of those stimulants sometimes people are cautious about, but we're moving towards a position where if we feel as we go along we need to medicate it. then
And
we will medicate it.
is part of you holding on to that idea that ADHD might be the sort of part of the superpower of you?
Well, she did say part of the issue that I'm now going to have to is having spent all this time telling you that anxiety didn't help you. She's like, ADHD does have there are some advantages. It's a superpower. I think Reese Nicholson and Reese also has ADHD, and we've talked about the fact that it's a superpower in the way that if every third time he blasted off, he shit his pants. It's a sort of superpower with some slapstick negative consequences. And that's why he wears the extra underpants on the outside so he can change his pants quickly. But yeah, I don't know how I feel about it. I think it's interesting. I have some friends, and it's really interesting because I know a bunch of people with ADHD who work in the media or the creative space, and about half of them will tell you that they struggle to write when they're on the medication because actually some of that, the sort of ripple effect of your brain is kind of how you make interesting connections.
I know people who will stop for a while if they need to suddenly.
Yeah. And then there are other people that will say the total opposite. Will say, I've been able to, I wrote a book, or I wrote a full screenplay because I suddenly was able to knuckle down, focus on everything and get it done. I think it seems to affect people in different ways, and there's a lot of trial and error. And so I'm only moving cautiously because I need to also keep my awareness of the medical side. But I know people whose lives were changed by being medicated for these things. So it's definitely something I'm open to. But I think understanding a lot of that stuff has been really useful for me in terms of setting it in context. Like I always felt sort of embarrassed. Not sort of embarrassed. I felt completely embarrassed for a while that I had got, because I still think PTSD, I thought PTSD was something that people who basically like survivors of sexual abuse or soldiers got. And definitely the only piece of resistance when I was talking about this stuff initially, I was never resistant to the therapy, but I would keep a bit of shame at my core of thinking, wow, I think in the show, when I talk about it in the show, I'm presenting this as a unhelpful thought. I say something like, wow, you got shell shocked by a bread roll, essentially.
But then, I was thinking while you were talking about it, were a spectator journalist listening to this podcast, that would be the headline.
Yeah.
Nish Kumar had 4 years of therapy because of a bread roll, because he's such a fucking...
That's actually how it was presented by spectator journalists.
Well, so like, the body does not care what you think about whether it's justified or not, or about whether this only happens to... Because it's like, it's happening to you, mate.
Yeah.
So you can deal with it or you can ignore it.
Yeah. It was interesting because when I read that, there was a thing in the Spectator about it.
That's mad.
Yeah. I'll tell you who wrote it off mic.
Okay.
But it was, it didn't upset me. There was a part of me, I always thought, when I started doing the show about it, I always thought, if this kind of, they might write. And then when I did actually see it, I just thought, God, you people are absolute bellends. Like, it didn't make me angry at all. It just made me think, God, there's really very little to say.
So I guess my final question is, given that it's sort of like chapter number 34 of I Could Not Do What You Do, but given that your stand-up is, political in a world where politics is just something I'm quite happy to take big breaks from.
Yeah.
Given that it is fighting for what is just and fair and decent in a world where those things are really not seem to be high on people's priority lists. Given that involving yourself with the research and the sort of reading of the news necessary to make podcasts and stand-up about politics, how are you protecting yourself or how are you planning to move forward, knowing that you're going to be watching a lot of stuff that's really horrible, and you're going to be talking about why can't a world be decent in a world that's showing itself to be pretty indecent for a long time, probably?
Yes, I'm protecting myself really. Therapy is a big part of it for me. And, that it's scheduled in my work diary. It's a non-negotiable part of my week. And the only times it gets moved are really when travel makes it impossible. That's kind of a non-negotiable thing for me. I think also I'm slightly... I've sort of slightly... I've withdrawn. There's bits of the internet that I'm sort of withdrawn from because I think it's not really productive for me to see a lot of that stuff that's being written about me. And so there are elements of the internet that I just don't venture towards anymore.
You described in your stand-up special, you said it was about the absolute cesspool of the political situation in Britain and America. And that's in 2019.
That's it. Yeah. I'm probably talking there in 2022, maybe.
No. You're talking about your 2019 show in a PR interview where you're
oh God.
But like, how do you keep going?
I mean, I think that. Well, I think there's probably two answers to this. I think one of them is that I do not subscribe to the idea that stand-up comedy is therapy. I do not subscribe to that in any way, shape, or form. The thing that's helped me do stand-up about some of these issues and continue doing the kind of stand-up is therapy, right? But I've also... Sometimes people after shows will say, I don't know how you do that. Like, how do you do that? And the thing is, the people that come to see me, the thing I always say to them is, you feel all those things. Always. Right? The audiences of my shows, these are all people that are thinking about this stuff all the time. It's kind of the one uniting thread of quite a sort of group of people that are often quite disparate in their ethnicities, sexual orientations, and ages. There's 15-year-olds and 70-year-olds. They're often quite disparate walks of life. The one thing that unites them is, a lot of the time, this kind of burning sense of fear about what's going on in the world. There is something, whilst it's not therapeutic in the medical sense, there is something cathartic about being able to go on stage and just say, holy shit, what the fuck is going on? That bit is cathartic for me. That is really cathartic. And
because as a sane person in a mad world, are you able to create in those stand-up environments a sane person in a sane world?
Yeah.
Even though what they're talking about is mad.
Yeah. There's like a comfort in saying something, in telling a joke that kind of contains an idea that I believe in, and people laughing at it. There's something really satisfying about that. There's something really satisfying about being in those rooms and seeing those people. And genuinely, like, one of the sort of great privileges is that I get to meet people sometimes after shows that come to say hello. And they will often be people that are, working in politics, or, teachers or charity workers. Or one guy in Indianapolis was a union organizer who was in the middle of a labor dispute, and he'd hopped out for a couple of hours to watch me do comedy. That stuff is, because it's funny because afterwards people will say, well, you're really doing something to help. And you're like, no, I'm not. I'm doing fucking stand-up comedy. You people are actually, a lot of the time you look at the audience, you go, you're actually doing the meaningful things that are helping, push back against a lot of this stuff. It's very, and doing the podcast, I've been able to sometimes sit face to face with people that are actually thinking carefully about how we resolve a lot of the problems that we're experiencing. And so part of the reason I'm able to do it is quite comforting to be in those rooms and do the sort of type of comedy that I've been doing. But also, I love comedy. I'm a comedian. It didn't come naturally to me. I'm a comedian because I loved comedy. I'm a comedy nerd that became a comedian. And so I love all comedy, and I I'm so passionate about the diversity, and I'm passionate about, demographic diversity in comedy, but I'm also passionate about stylistic diversity. And one of the best things about a stand-up night is you could go there and it could be a person doing stand-up about the news, surreal one-liners, someone doing a character, and then a compere who's asking people what they do for a living. Is all legitimate, and it's so brilliant. And when I was 17, I still think Ross Noble is the coolest guy in the world. To me, like, it was everything he met everything with the same equanimity, and so everything. But if you look at, he's one of my favorite comedians of all time. That's not what I do. And so, but I passionately believe in that there should be all sorts of diversity. But there is a part of comedy that, when I was a kid, really had a way of making me feel better. And sometimes that was because it was escapist, but a lot of the time it was things like Goodness Gracious Me and The Simpsons and the Chris Rock stand-up specials from the turn of the millennium. It was, Chris Morris stuff, because it made me feel better that somebody was taking something I was afraid of and making it funny. That it's a very, I think it's such a normal, emotional response to something that you're frightened by, is sort of to turn it into something silly, like the release of turning a scary thing into something funny. So so whilst I truly loved all types of comedy, there was something about that particularly affected me as a teenager. And I think that is sort of, and why I do the type of comedy that I do, is that I also found when I started doing comedy that telling those jokes had the same effect on me. And as telling those jokes had the same effect on me as hearing those jokes from other people when I was a teenager. And that was really, that's really why I still do it, and I love doing it. And when I listen to an old Richard Pryor album, there's those early albums from the 70s. I mean, he's talking about the most serious things possible. There's just a bit in it where, because also there isn't a sad bit in those albums. He's just talking about, it's constantly so funny, but there'll just be a bit sometimes that just hits you out of nowhere, where he's just talking about it, and then he's talking about alien invasions. And he says, white people are very scared of alien invasions, but nothing can scare a black person, not after 400 years of this shit. And that line, it lands like a hammer, even though it's not maudlin. There's not a section laid out for it in the show. It's just that line just lands. And I think that there is something really that I am fascinated by in, standing on stage and, it's like sword swallowing or something, or like juggling fire. You're sort of standing there and you're taking all these big subjects and you're trying to walk the tightrope of making them funny whilst not undermining the seriousness of the issues. That as an intellectual challenge, that sort of appeals to me. And also, I'm just doing the thing that I wanted, that I saw in other people, because I found that doing it gives me the same level of release.
Well, Nish Kumar, thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely fantastic.
My pleasure. And as I said at the start, in reality, I've got fuck all else. I think airline food is broadly fine.
Yeah. It's not bad. And especially if you tell them you need a vegan one or a gluten-free one. So Nish, thank you so much. And I hope you'll join us for our bonus podcast, The Gratitude List. There you go. There was my chat with Nish Kumar. I do hope you found that helpful. Nish will be joining me again on Thursday for our bonus podcast, The Gratitude List. And if you want to get in touch with the show, then send your thoughts and reflections to hello@howdoyoucopepod.com. We do love to hear your thoughts and musings on these episodes. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at howdoyoucopepod. Plus, don't forget, all new episodes of How Do You Cope are now on YouTube, so watch and subscribe there. How Do You Cope is a significant production. See you next time.